Rome was reeling. It had just suffered what was quite possibly the worst defeat in its history at the Caudine Forks, and it seemed as though the Samnites were about to triumph over their age-old enemy. And yet, Rome was not quite finished. Spurius Postumius, the consul who had signed the humiliating treaty at the Caudine Forks, had relit a fire under the Senate and the people of Rome with his speech before the new consuls. He had pointed out that the people in the Senate of Rome were not party to his treaty. Instead, himself and the other signatories were the only people who had to suffer the indignity the treaty prescribed. With his sacrifice, he pushed Rome back into its warring spirit. But the pains of humiliation were not quite over just yet. What else would Rome endure? Could they overcome it, or would the Samnites finally triumph over the Roman menace? Let's talk about it. We actually pick back up in 321, the same year that the humiliation at the Caudine Forks occurred. While Rome reeled in the aftermath, the Samnites were busy making moves. First of all, Satricum, a town in Latium, had defected over to the Samnite side. It's not quite clear if this move was solely undertaken by Satricum and its leaders, or if the Samnites had some sort of influence on the move. Another city, Fragile, where this war had really started, was also taken in a nighttime raid by the Samnites, likely helped by the men from Satricum. Finally though, in 320 BCE, the consuls and their armies were now ready to march into war. Lucius Papyrus took his army deep into Apula, while Quintus Philo stayed in Samnium to counter the Samnite presence in the region. Lucius moved his army to the city of Lucera, the town where the Roman hostages were being held. At first, neither side made many moves. The two Roman armies had essentially split the main Samnite force. The Samnites couldn't march to Lucera, as that would expose them to an attack from the rear by Philo. But if they attacked Philo, they risked either being attacked by Lucius Papyrus or simply giving up Lucera and with it the Roman hostages. The hostages, while certainly not a material goal of the Roman army, did present an incredible opportunity to improve Roman morale. So the Samnites were in a bit of a bind. But of the two options, the choice was fairly clear. They had to attack Philo. We are told that this battle was an absolute bloodbath. The Romans were in such a frenzy that the commanders barely even had a chance to engage in any actual tactics. Instead, the bitter feelings of humiliation pushed the Romans into a mindless frenzy, and bands of Roman soldiers ripped into the Samnite lines, slaughtering indiscriminately. The Samnites were routed, and the Romans were so brutal that even the plunder carried by the Samnites was destroyed in their overzealous attempt to redeem their country's honor. Meanwhile, back with Lucius Papyrus, the situation was not quite as successful. Lucius had managed to make it to the city of Apri, the whole time being harassed and followed by a sizable Samnite contingent. Here, a stroke of luck saved Lucius. Apparently, the locals were a bit fed up with the Samnites. Despite technically being allies, the people of this area had been harassed and raided by small parties of Samnites for centuries, and that mutual hate is hard to get rid of. Because of this, the locals gleefully offered to supply the Romans, and this food proved to be invaluable for the Roman army, and was frankly the only reason they were able to survive in the Apulan countryside. This stalemate changed with the arrival of the newly victorious Philo. Philo was now able to turn his attention to attacking and stopping the various baggage trains that were bringing the Samnites their supply from Samnium proper. With the supply line cut off, the Samnites were forced to give battle to the Romans, or face starvation. While the two sides prepared for battle, a group of emissaries from the city of Tarentum appeared in the two camps. The group ordered the two sides to cease their fighting, and promised that whichever side stood in the way of this ceasefire would be considered an enemy of Tarentum, and dealt with accordingly. At first, the consuls humored the request, and seemed to play along. However, when the auspices were taken, they showed favorable omens for battle, and that was that. With approval from the gods, the Romans were going to battle. The Romans quickly forced their way into the Samnite camp, and we are told by Livy that had the consuls not called the Roman men back, that each and every Samnite would have been slaughtered. Following this victory, the city of Lucretia was taken, and the hostages released. The remaining Samnite soldiers were forced to walk under the yoke, and for now, Rome's desire for revenge was sated. The war, though, was not yet over, but there would be a short truce. The Samnites sent envoys to Rome in 318 with the hope of securing the so far elusive peace treaty. Of course, and big shock here, the Romans refused, but a 2-year truce was agreed upon. In the meantime, the cities of Tinium and Cassinium in Apula submitted to the Romans. and the city of Fermentium and Satricum were brought back into the Roman fold as well. In 316, the war began anew. This time, we are told that the Romans had appointed a dictator to carry out the war. This dictator was Lucius Aemilius. Lucius Aemilius was a fairly respected Roman statesman, who had already served as consul and dictator, and probably seemed like a decent choice to ensure that Rome would be able to overcome the Samnites. He didn't disappoint. Lucius besieged the town of Saticula, a Samnite city that was right on the border between Campania and Samnium. The Samnites quickly responded, and set up their camp near the Roman encampment. We aren't quite told what the general setup here was, just that the Roman and Samnite camp were close to each other. But we know that the Samnites and the Saticulans were able to coordinate a dangerous double attack. The Saticulans suddenly, and with no warning, flung their gates open, and charged the Roman positions closest to them. At the same time, the Samnites emptied their camp and attacked the portion of the Roman camp closest to them. We are told that both the Samnite and the Saticulan armies only just equaled the force that Rome had brought to prosecute the war. Because of this, and the fact that Rome was famously great at building stout fortifications, Lucius was able to leave a small force on the side of the camp the Samnites were attempting to break through, while he led the bulk of the force against the Saticulans. This proved successful, and Lucius was able to force the Saticulans to retreat back into their city. Leaving a force large enough to hold the Saticulans, Lucius turned his attention back to the Samnites. We are told that this battle raged much longer, and the fighting was slow and fierce. Eventually, the Samnites were forced to retreat back into their camp, but the fall of night forced the Romans to pull back, and the Samnites were given the opportunity to leave, an opportunity they took. In retaliation, the Samnite force besieged, and seemingly conquered, the city of Philistica, a Roman ally. By 315, Lucius Aemilius' term as dictator was over, and the Romans turned to our favorite rule breaker, Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus, to try and close the war out. Remember him? No? Well, he was the guy who was appointed as Lucius Papyrus' master of the horse, and the guy who disobeyed a direct order from Lucius Papyrus to not engage the enemy, and despite winning that engagement, was nearly executed for his defiance. Now, the apprentice had become the master, or I guess the master had become the dictator? I don't know, I'm still workshopping that one. In any case, Quintus marched down to Saticula to take over the situation, and bring the Roman army some much needed reinforcements. The Samnites had also brought reinforcements, and had set up a camp in a similar manner to last year's engagement, and had been working to try and draw the Romans into another fight. The Romans had their eyes on Saticula though, and refused to give battle. At some point, the Romans mounted another assault on the city. At the same time, the Samnites sprung forward and assaulted the rear of the Roman camp. Quintus Aulus Serentanus, the master of the horse, had been left in charge of the camp, while Quintus, seriously too many guys named that by the way, Fabius led the charge on the city. Serentanus led a countercharge with all of the Roman cavalry still in the camp. This was probably a fairly large force, as cavalry typically don't do a whole lot during a siege. The charge was so fierce and sudden that it caught the Samnites off guard, and actually allowed Serentanus to kill the Samnite commander. This infuriated the Samnites, who apparently fired volley after volley of missiles at the charging Roman cavalry. At some point during the chaos, the Samnite commander's brother had the opportunity to avenge his brother's death, and managed to kill Serentanus, literally ripping him off his horse. The Samnites surged forward in an attempt to retrieve both the body of Serentanus and their fallen leader. The Romans, though, were not going to allow that to happen. As one, the cavalry dismounted and formed a circle around the bodies. As the Romans in the center picked the bodies up and began to carry them back to camp, the Romans at the front fought the Samnite infantry to a standstill. The Romans were able to retreat back to their camp, while the now leaderless Samnites were forced to do the same. Later that day, the Samnites retreated, and only a few days later, the Romans captured Saticula. The theater of war then moved to the town of Sora. Sora was a Volscian town that had recently, probably in 345 or so, been subject to a fairly strong colonization effort by the Romans. Because of this, the town's majority inhabitants, who were Volscians, had received the Samnite offer to come over to the Samnite side with open arms. They revolted, and many of the Roman colonists were either killed or exiled. We are told that shortly after that, a battle occurred as the Roman army marched towards Sora near a place called Latulae. We are given two different accounts of this battle by Livy. Livy's preferred account tells of a battle in permanent stalemate, with it only ending in an undetermined fashion with the coming of night. At that point, the two armies both decided to leave and seek better positions to continue on with the war. However, Livy does mention an alternate account, whereby the Samnites absolutely crushed the Romans. Here, Livy tells us that the Romans had come to this battle with most of their new and raw recruits, while the Samnite army was made up of some of the most experienced and well-trained forces they had. As you can imagine, this was an absolute slaughter, and the Romans were no match for the Samnites. In fact, we are actually told by Livy that in this account, Quintus Fabius, the master of the horse, died in this battle, instead of the one back at Saticula. This battle would further split the Roman state into two, with the northern half being Roman citizens and loyal to the Roman cause, and the southern half being mostly allied towns, who were open to Samnite overtures. I will say here that I personally believe in the second account, as it would explain why quite a few Volscian, Auruntian, and Campanian allies of Rome were seemingly more hesitant to help, and even rebellious in the years to come. It would make sense that Rome suffered some sort of defeat, and that defeat pushed those allied towns to question their allegiances. In any case, Rome quickly recovered. In 314 BCE, the new consuls, Marcus Potellus and Gaius Sulpicius, led more troops to Sora. The town would have been very difficult to take, had it not been for some men willing to betray their city. It's hard to tell who exactly these men were, but many historians speculate that they were actually Roman colonists who had been skipped over or simply missed in the initial culling, and were thus eager to put Rome back in charge. These deserters told the Romans to move their camp back a few miles from the city. This would lull the men inside of Sora into a false sense of security, and the defenses would be lacking. After this, he led a group of roughly 10 men through a steep and difficult path into the main citadel of the city. At this point, he placed the men in strategic and visible areas of the citadel, all in the hopes of proving that the Romans had managed to capture the area. He then ran through the streets, shouting that the Romans had infiltrated the city and taken the citadel, and were preparing to assault the residential areas. This, of course, caused a massive amount of panic, especially after it was confirmed that there were Roman soldiers visible at the citadel. The citizens of Sora were now in complete panic mode, and common sense made its way out of their minds. They opened the city's main gate and fled through it. This was exactly what the Romans had been told to plan for. As soon as the gate was opened, a few Roman cohorts charged through and quickly overran the remaining garrison, and with that, captured the town. The leading men of Sora were executed, and a large Roman garrison was set up to control the town. After this, Rome turned its attention towards more of the rebellious towns. The towns of Asuna, Minturnae, and Vessi, all Asuni towns, had rebelled against Rome following the Battle of Latune. We aren't given much detail, but we are told that in a manner similar to that of Sora, all three cities were captured by the Romans. Apparently, though, the consuls were not present at the time of their capture, and because of that, the Roman troops had free rein to slaughter as they pleased. Livy tells us that, quote, because the leaders were not present when the attack was made, there was no limit to the slaughter, and the Asuni nation was wiped out, end quote. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds a bit like genocide to me. After this, the two consuls succeeded in pushing deeper into Samnium proper, and apparently even managed to lay siege to Bivinium, the capital of the Pentri, the largest Samnite tribe, and the de facto capital of the Samnite state. The siege ended inconclusively following the winter months, as Rome turned their attention to the towns of Fragile and Potelius, two towns that the Samnites had just managed to take. The army was taken over by Gaius Potelius Libovolsus, a new dictator, and he managed to retake the two cities. We are told that around the same time, the Romans burned the city of Nola, and a massive number of colonists were sent to formerly Volscian areas in the hope of ensuring future loyalty. These included the island of Ponte, the Volscian town of Intermara Susana, and at Susia Arsuna. But this is where we will stop for today. The Romans and the Samnites have been trading blows for about 3 years now, and once again the war entered into a bit of a stalemate. Towns had been conquered, but then simply regained, and truly not much had changed. Yes, Rome managed to make it to Bivinium, but when your army is forced to leave that siege to retake two important towns, can you really call that a victory? So, yes, for now the two sides were at a standstill, and it seemed as though the war was winding down. However, something was about to change that, something big. It's time for our old friends the Etruscans to enter the fray. Join me next time as we see the rest of Italy begin to unite against Rome. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. I sadly am having to split the series into one more part. I thought this episode would be the last, but as I wrote more and more, it became pretty clear that one more episode would be needed. Plus, I think that the entrance of the Etruscans sort of changes the way the war should be looked at, so I think it needs its own video to really explore that. So that last episode will come out on Monday, December 4th, and should finish up the war. I do have a quick question for those of you who have made it so far. Would you all be interested in me uploading the series on the Samnite War and some of our other series into one large supercut of videos? So, for instance, uploading the 10 or so videos on the Roman kings into one large supercut, and eventually uploading the series on the Samnite Wars into one large supercut as well. I think it would be an easier way to watch, or even rewatch the whole series, but if it's not something you all are interested in, then I won't bother. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you have any comments or questions on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.